This week on the right side, in Alberta, Clickbait dominates a headline about UCP education policy. The BC NDP flip-flop and conduct dozens of partisan appointments. The media questions the accuracy of polling. And an acquitted ISIS fan fights to stay in Canada. Should he be able to? This is The Right Side, episode 36, recorded Saturday, September 30th, 2017. Clickbait and non-coverage. Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Right Side. Patrick and myself are back as we have been for every weekend since January. Welcome back.
It's good to be back, and we're getting near the end of September. Weather's changing, and Parliament's back in session, so there's definitely lots to talk about this week.
Indeed there is, and you might be wondering what we're going to talk about. Well, we've got stories ranging all the way from Alberta, BC, and Canada as well. And what we're going to do with these is what we're going to do every other week here at The Right Side. We're going to cut through bias and sensationalism and attempt to provide the true side of the story of what's going on here. So I think we're going to be doing a lot of that this week. It's not going to be one of those obscene head-scratching weeks, but nonetheless, we're just going to power on through this and go through the news of the week and provide context and clarity to it. So we're going to start off with Alberta this week, and the headline is, Alberta Premier Rachel Notley says United Conservatives are determined to bring harm to gay children. So the United Conservatives, yeah, and for anyone following along here at the show notes at rightsidenews.ca, if you go to this actual story here, you'll see that it's only a couple paragraphs long. 6 paragraphs to be precise, 6 paragraphs in one sentence. So it's a wonder as to what is going to be mentioned in these 6 paragraphs that's going to show how the United Conservatives are determined to bring harm to gay children. So the article starts off by saying the United Conservatives are determined to bring harm to gay children. Those are direct words from Premier Rachel Notley. She spoke these comments during a speech of the Alberta NDP Provincial Council. And, of course, she was referring to UCP leadership candidate Jason Kenney. The article in question here comes from the National Post. So first and foremost, it doesn't actually quote Jason Kenney and what his specific policies for schools and GSAs would be. Those are the gay-straight alliances. Secondly, there's obviously some attempt here being made by the National Post to generate clicks, likes, or ad views with this story. And you can see that because the story is just so short and there's no real information in the story. So we were forced to go elsewhere and find more information on this. And when the National Post or any major paper writes such an inflammatory headline, you would expect that it is such a huge issue that a potential UCP government would be sending these kids for shock therapy because determined to bring harm. That just sounds like it's a phrase out of a different century.
It's a very loaded statement, and it's something that I think even if the National Post was correct in saying that, as putting that as their headline, they should have been a bit more. They should have had a bit more integrity in what they were actually writing.
Right.
It's clear that Notley said that, and that was something that she said. And premiers are quoted all the time on what they say, but that's
it's the job of the media to fact check them, back them up, and provide the true story of what's going on. So that's what we're going to do here right now. So back in August, Jason Kenney said that parents have a right to know if their child joins a GSA at school, unless there are fears of abuse at home. Jason Kenney said this. And, this turned into the policy by the NDP government that a potential UCP government would out kids at schools. But Jason Kenney did indeed say that if there are fears of abuse at home, that the joining of the GSA would be kept private. So for anyone who has actually been watching the UCP leadership race unfold will know that this is something that Jason Kenney has been talking about with his education policy. He's also a strong proponent of having educational decisions made at the local level and having parents heavily involved in their child's education wherever possible. This was on showcase at the UCP leadership debate in Edmonton this past week, and it was also available to be covered at this debate for free by the media. And the media was there and had a Q&A session after there with the candidates. So following on this comment from Rachel Notley, the education minister also got involved in this. He classed this as, quote, dangerous political rhetoric from Kenny and the UCP, and further says that it's forcing the province to introduce legislation to make it illegal for schools to, quote, out students who join gay-straight alliances. This, of course, also forced legal advisors to weigh in on the story, including John Corpay, who is the president of the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms in Calgary. He said that Alberta law requires parents to be, quote, fully informed about all aspects of their children's education. This does, of course, include the involvement of extracurricular activities. Anything that prohibits a parent from knowing what their child is up to, barring exceptional circumstances, would be violating a parent's rights and responsibilities to their children. Which, considering this is already defined in Alberta law, one could say that the existing books the existing GSA legislation that's on the books and what the NDP wants to bring in could indeed be against another law that's here in Alberta. But anyways, the NDP government is drafting legislation to this effect for the fall sitting that would protect the right to establish a GSA in schools and also to ensure the privacy of students. And also, as illustrated by John Carpay, this could cause legal issues if this bill were to become law. The bill would also include penalties, the exact penalties which haven't been determined, but schools that don't comply could risk funding cuts or the loss of their accreditation. So while the NDP is claiming dangerous political rhetoric, the media is guilty for not reporting on all the facts on Jason Kenney's educational policy and giving the NDP a path to enact their own educational policy without it being thoroughly vetted either. As you can see here, if the media was doing its job and focusing on both sides rather than just air quoting what is going to generate the most traction from what the premier said, I think we would be having a much more substantive and valuable discussion with this.
Mm-hmm. I think what you just said right there and what you have in your notes is far better than any actual article that's on the subject. Most of the articles that have come out about this, they've been like really short, very clickbaity. They're trying to get you outraged at the United Conservatives for doing this, and they're not even going out of their way to really change anything. What it's on the books already as legislation is what they're wanting to support anyways. So it's not like they're going to change anything. It's the NDP that are wanting to change something here.
And you know, with a little bit of research, all it takes to figure out is that, we already have legislation here in Alberta that says that anything that goes on in schools, parents have a right to know about, and there are provisions in school to deal with students who are being abused at home. So in many ways, this is almost a non-issue. But, you know, just the way it's being covered and the way it's being talked about by the media, it's building into more of an issue than it actually is. And, you know, you got to remember that the majority of people in Alberta live in Edmonton and Calgary, and that is where most of these papers are going to be based. So that is also, of course, playing to the base right now of the NDP. So, I mean, it kind of makes sense that they want to drive sales and revenues and whatnot for the papers, but let's do some real journalism here.
Yeah, and exactly. And it's also curious that the NDP are trying to do this, considering you might remember a couple months ago we did the article that they're trying to court voters in the center or that are more socially liberal but economically conservative. They're trying to court those voters to come back to the NDP or stay with the NDP, and by them bringing up such a polarizing social issue on this, where they're trying to basically discredit the United Conservatives and say that they're going to be hardcore religious and family values, which a lot of more centrist, like-minded people would probably not go for. So they're trying to portray the United Conservatives as being further to the right than what they actually are in order to bring them to the NDP. So they're making a political statement on this as well, and I think that's something that's been flying under the radar of all the media that's talked about this.
Oh yeah, definitely. Because you can have social policy and you can talk about school choice and whatnot. And there are so many schools in Alberta. There are public schools, private schools, Catholic schools, and the Catholic schools, of course, fall under the public system as well. And there's so much choice for education in Alberta at a school level, and inside actual schools as well. There's choice between programs and whatnot to have that tailored towards individual students. So, just looking at what Alberta is, what year it is, and, the way our education system has been built up, just say that a teacher who is, going to be trained at a very high level from one of our universities here is going to out a student when there could be a potential problem at home. It's just fear mongering from the media. So, and this is definitely something that also came up in the debate this week because Doug Schweitzer, who's running, said that he wants to leave all the social issues in the past and describes himself as a social moderate. So in a way, this discussion is actually happening in the UCP as well, but it's just something that needs to be focused on properly by the UCP, and the media needs to cover both sides fairly. So,
Indeed.
All right. So what do you got for BC?
Well, I've got a very interesting story this week, but first, before we do that, let's take a time machine back to 2013, back when the BC Liberals were in power and the BC NDP were in opposition. So this was a statement that was said by John Horgan on July 4th, 2013. He said, "It seems to be the foundation of the BC Liberals' jobs plan. Every time we look at the orders in council, there's a new failed candidate who has been given a sizable pay increase and is now working on the government dime. There are no job qualifications for them. Were they interviewed for the positions against other qualified candidates? We have a basement teeming with interns, young, capable people who don't profess to have a partisan stripe, working for both caucuses. Did they have an opportunity to get one of those jobs?" And it's also something that the Minister of Public Safety and Solicitor General, Mike Farnworth, said back then. He said, "The only thing that's transparent and consistent is the BC Liberals' abandonment of merit in favor of appointing failed candidates, friends, and political insiders," he said back in January 16th, 2014. And this was in response to the Liberals hiring defeated candidates and party sympathizers to key jobs and commission boards. So this is another thing that kind of doomed the Liberals as being a party of cronyism and corruption and nepotism that would allow them to that basically had them appointing party insiders to key government jobs. So now let's fast forward back into 2017, and on Wednesday, the very same Mike Farnworth said that every government that comes into office brings in their own staff, and that the NDP is doing nothing wrong for doing the same thing. He said, "We've only hired one defeated candidate," and he added that the NDP has taken a more measured approach overall to terminations and hires than the Liberals. So now that we're getting underway into the fall session, it's actually found out the BC NDP government has now stacked its new offices and the province's communications branch with dozens of former party workers and partisan loyalists in the kind of patronage hiring spree that it used to decry under the previous Liberal government. So now in power, it doesn't view those types of hires as a problem anymore. In an emailed statement, the Premier's office said, "It is both normal and necessary to hire staff who share the government's vision and can implement its commitments. Our government has been fully transparent about its staff appointments, including salaries." So it's very interesting how that has come through, and According to the Post Media, the government's ministerial assistant and communications jobs are littered with young New Democrats, former Alberta NDP staff, former federal NDP staff, and 11 former NDP constituency assistants, and at least 6 former Vision Vancouver staffers.
Well, so that's
Who,
where they've been going. There has been some staff changes here in the Alberta NDP.
yeah, they've all jumped ship to BC with the new BC NDP government. In one case, the NDP actually hired Cassandra Dyke, who was the party's failed 2013 candidate in Courtney Comox, and she was hired to an $800,000 a year ministerial assistant job to Health Minister Adrian Dix. And the new ministerial
800,000?
assistants, 80,000. My
Okay. Okay,
apologies.
good.
That's not quite as much as 800,000, but it's still a significant amount. So the assistants also include Kayleigh Frampton, who was an NDP digital campaigner in the 2017 election, Serena Talbot, who was an NDP field organizer in the same election, Laurie Ann Winstanley, who was a veteran NDP campaigner who most recently worked at the Move Up Union, and Christian Romulo Avendano, who was a canvasser and a fundraiser for the party during by-elections in 2016 and the election in 2017. So the salaries range between $72,000 and $94,500 for the senior assistants. So this is it's a practice that the BC Green Party also disagrees with, and whose agreement the minority NDP government requires to stay in power. Green leader Andrew Weaver said in an interview, "It's offensive, actually, and this is why the taxpayer gets so disenfranchised with our political system, is that you criticize someone for doing something, and then you go ahead and do the exact same thing." He said it's hypocritical for the NDP to stack publicly paid jobs with campaign officials and well-connected loyalists when, as opposition, the party explicitly promised to not commit the same mistakes. And he says that it's similar to the NDP's promise to ban corporate and union donations while still holding the cash for access fundraisers, just like the BC Liberals did. He said, quote, "I find it sickening and saddening in the same time that they continue to do this because it turns people off, and what we're trying to do is get them re-engaged in our democracy, excited for a change, and then we see this kind of crap going on," said Weaver. "It really hurts."
That's very
So yeah,
interesting. It's so interesting that this is happening, and Andrew Weaver is a part of the organization that's holding this government up. As to whether or not this will help Weaver going forward, because he is taking a stand against it, but if he's not doing more to prevent it from happening, I guess there could be questions that would be asked of him next time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's the one that's holding the government in power, and that they're continuing to prop up the NDP when they're doing things that supposedly sicken them. It doesn't make much sense, does it?
Not at all.
And it's also interesting how before the election, the NDP worked really hard to say how different they were from the NDP governments in the 1990s, and how they would do politics differently than the BC Liberals. They wanted to be more open, they wanted to have more merit-based appointments, and now that they've barely squeaked into power, they're basically raising the amount of money spent on the public service, and they're rewarding their own NDP friends and loyalists just as the BC Liberals did. So it's almost like they're doing the exact same thing except from the other side of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how much hypocrisy there is with all this.
That happened here too. The NDP under Rachel Notley said that they were going to, change the way the government worked, and the PC government had much the same problems, internal corruption and whatnot, and lots of appointments with former PC staffers and whatnot. But of course, that just continued under the NDP, and if anything, it actually increased. So we seem to be seeing a correlation here among NDP governments.
Indeed.
Or maybe governments in general, if you include the Alberta PCs.
Yeah, this might just be a political thing where you just hire the friends that you like and that you know will share your views, and that if you're not in power, you will automatically criticize that. But then when you get into
Yep.
power, you do the same thing. It just goes to show that when you really have to take what the parties say in their platforms with a real, like, a large grain of salt.
What's the
Because
media got to say on this? Are they holding anyone accountable?
I don't think they are. I mean, Weaver apparently doesn't like it, and he's very heavily quoted by the media as saying that he doesn't like it. But is he going to vote? Is he going to work against the NDP on this issue? It's hard to say. I mean, he's the reason why they're in power in the first place right now. So,
Yeah.
well, I mean, I don't think he'll want to make this an election issue. So, and the NDP, it seems like the Vancouver Sun and Province, the Post Media, there's one guy there, Rob Shaw, who's been writing about it, and he's the only one that's kind of really mentioned it that much. And the national media hasn't been talking about it, and even the local media here in Victoria hasn't been talking about it either. So it's hard to say whether they will continue talking about it at all, or if it'll just get swept under in the next news cycle.
All right. Well, let's move to Canada and talk about something that gets swept under all too often, and that is the viability or the inaccuracy of polls when it comes to polling political parties. So, there was a story in Global News this week based on a poll that was put out by Forum Research. But before that, we're roughly 2 years out from the next federal election. Could come sooner or maybe even later. But if the laws followed, our next federal election will be in October 2019. And as we all know, a week is a long time in politics, and what we're going to be seeing in 2 years from now is anyone else's guess. So this week, a poll was released by Forum Research. The poll says that the Conservatives would receive 39% of the vote and the Liberals would receive 35% of the vote. Projections, past history, and mathematical analysis can then, of course, be applied to these poll numbers to forecast seat counts. People do that all the time. And these numbers would give the Conservatives a near majority minority government of 169 seats. The Liberals would receive 130, the NDP 26, the Bloc 12, and Elizabeth May would hold on to her seat out west. So here at the right side, we're always skeptical of polls, and I think rightly so. You can look at sentiment polls to get a feeling of what the general population is thinking about a certain issue, but when the same methodology is applied to vote preference, we need to think about a whole slew of other factors. So we had the 2011 federal election where a conservative minority was forecast, but we ended up with a pretty big conservative majority. The Alberta election in 2012 that forecast a Wild Rose majority, but in reality we saw a huge PC majority instead. And of course, Donald Trump was forecast to lose to Hillary by double digits, but he's now president. So polls can be wrong, obviously. Now, why are we talking about this now? Well, the headline from Global reads, "Poll finds Scheer's Tories ahead of Trudeau's Liberals, but can we believe it?" Polls need to be taken with a grain of salt, as I outlined above, and it's always interesting to note that this time the media chose to bring this particular issue up of whether or not we can trust the polls. We rarely hear about the accuracy of polls in an election campaign, let alone they be outright question the accuracy of them. We also tend to hear more about the accuracy of polls from the media when a conservative is ahead, as is the case with this poll. So this is ultimately a great article from Global, and it should be stickied, pinned, or rerun whenever an election campaign is underway. Because it's something that the media and voters need to be aware of, because ask yourself a question. How many people could potentially change their vote because of the way a poll is leaning? The article says rival pollsters and statistics scientists will have their own opinions, but the only real answer is that we truly cannot know if this is an outlier or reality unless we had an actual general election and were able to compare Forum's polls to actual results. And this sums up nicely why polls should always be questioned and why we should be more cautious of their reporting, especially during an election campaign. The article also does something else nice, where it contrasts polls taken during the same time period, or at least relatively close to the Forum poll, and during the same week, Nanos, the Nanos tracking poll, had the Liberals with a 10-point lead. Campaign Research had a poll from the previous week with a 12-point lead from the Liberals, and Abacus Data was in the field on September 1st through 3rd and also found a 12-point lead. So as you can see, comparing polls taken in the month of September, this was an outlier. So the question to be asked about this is, why don't we see this kind of analysis from the media and pundits about polls during an actual election period? And why aren't the disclaimers regarding accuracy of polling brought up more often?
Yeah, it's something that we see all the time. I mean, in BC, in 2013, the NDP were supposed to have a majority government, but Christy Clark, in her own political party data, she knew that she would be able to win in 2013, and lo and behold, she did get her majority. Same thing, of course, didn't appear in 2017. But it just goes to show that political parties themselves have their own internal polling of how they gauge public opinion, and more often than not, they're actually more right than the actual polling.
Right, and the reason for that is they have more money to throw around than the media organizations do, so they can conduct a larger sample size more frequently. Because the polls are really only good for a snapshot in time of when they're taken. And, if there's finicky weighting being done with demographics about polls, if population is adjusted and skewed perhaps a little bit wrong, that can also skew results a bit.
And sample size has a lot to do with it as well. How many people are actually polled?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is something that should be a running disclaimer at the bottom or at the beginning of every story that runs about a poll in the mainstream media, because you watch the news during an election campaign and you see they have these nice little graphs with the party logos and the colors and the lines and everything, and it shows where they're at. But there is, just a little sometimes fine print at the bottom showing the sample size. But for someone who doesn't necessarily study statistics, they're not going to know what that sample size margin of error means. So this is a really good story, but at the same time, it's also kind of funny that we're seeing it right now, 2 years before an election, rather than during an election campaign itself. So, and I mean, maybe there could be something done like this in the media, and maybe a certain media agency could set themselves apart if they offered these kinds of honest discussions and disclaimers on polls compared to everyone else. Because like we said, or like you said, parties have their own data that's going to be more accurate. And if the media is reporting on their data and it's a few days old, it's inaccurate. So we'll have to see what happens in 2019, but this is just definitely something to think of next time you see a poll on the TV regarding a certain political party.
Indeed. All right. So with that, we're going to head over to the firing line, which is, of course, our segment that highlights something in the media that was either covered unfairly, or not covered hardly at all, or just had a very slanted look at the issue. So the headline here is "Acquitted ISIS supporter fights to stay in Canada." So in Canada, many like to look at the terrorism problems in Europe and say, I'm sure glad that doesn't happen here. Almost every conversation I've had with people about certain terrorist attacks that have happened in Europe, they almost always say that phrase. And the problem with that is that if we're not careful, it very well could happen here, and it has actually happened here in the past.
Definitely. There's lots of factors we got to watch out for that, but that's a topic for another show.
Indeed. So an article from Kim Bolan of the Vancouver Sun profiles a 2002 Jordanian refugee called Othman Hamdan, and he was living in Fort St. John and was arrested earlier in 2017 for terrorism charges, and just a few days ago he was acquitted. Hamdan is now appearing before the Canadian Border Services Agency to determine if he should be allowed to stay in Canada after Facebook posts supporting the Islamic State and an admission that he was once involved in an international hashish smuggling ring. So Hamdan is neither a Canadian citizen nor a permanent resident of Canada. He was a citizen of Jordan, which is a country just to the east of Israel. And he came to BC from the US in 2002 and made a successful refugee claim based on his conversion to Christianity. And he ended up later rejecting his new religion and went back to practicing Islam shortly after entering Canada. So Canadian Border Services official Randall Hyland says that the agency had grounds to believe that Hamdan was inadmissible as a security risk, as well as because of his serious criminality. Hyland asked at a detention hearing on Tuesday that Hamdan remain incarcerated until a full admissibility hearing can be held before the Refugee Board. The detention hearing was adjourned until next week. Hyland noted that the burden of proof to determine whether someone is inadmissible to remain in Canada is lower than the beyond a reasonable doubt standard, which is used by criminal courts to determine whether someone is guilty or not guilty of a criminal offense, such as his terrorism charges. So last Friday, BC Supreme Court Justice Bruce Butler acquitted Hamdan on 4 terrorism charges that were stemming from dozens of Facebook comments that he posted in 2014 and 2015, which were supporting ISIS and lone wolf attacks in Canada, the US, and other countries. Butler said that Hamdan's posts may be offensive to Canadians, but that doesn't mean that this Fort St. John man was encouraging or inciting acts of murder, assault, and mischief as alleged by the Crown. So Hamdan's lawyer, who was Erica Olmsted, argued Tuesday against his continued detention, saying it was unfair to keep him in jail given the not guilty verdict in the criminal case. She said if he is released into the community, he intends to stay at a shelter and apply for a work permit until he is, quote, back on his feet. However, Hyland pointed to some of the comments Hamdan made on Facebook that first caught the eye of RCMP investigators in the fall of 2014. One comment appeared to suggest that a dam in Revelstoke and a bridge in Ontario would be easy targets for terrorists. Quoting from Hamdan's Facebook page, he wrote, quote, "This dam supplies most of the west coast of the North American continent with power. The number of police officers in this town is between 20 and 30. The closest military base is 200 kilometers away. Security is weak." That was what he wrote in September 2014.
That's almost as though he was exactly casing the place and providing it up as a potential target list right there if you were looking for something to hit in Canada.
Exactly. And he's saying how important it was to our energy consumption, the amount of security that was in place, and how far away the military would be if something happened. I mean, that's a very serious post to be making right there. And there's another one that he wrote. He said, quote, "There is a bridge, Nipigon River Bridge, near a village, Nipigon, Ontario. It crosses a river and connects eastern Canada with western Canada, and it also carries a railroad. This bridge divides the country and in the middle, and its repair will take years. Security protection, zero." So it's another post along the same lines. So in another post, Hamdan appeared to be inciting violence through lone wolf attacks, and on February 25th, 2015, Hamdan posted an ISIS message on his Defeat of the Alliance Facebook page, which said, quote, "Our advice to supporters in the U.S., carry your actions there. Swiftly, lone wolves activate all across the USA." And in other Facebook posts, Hamdan praised Michael Zehaf-Bibeau, who attacked Parliament Hill on October 22, 2014, as well as Martin Couture-Rouleau, who drove a car into 2 Canadian soldiers in Quebec 2 days before. And the same day as the Ottawa attack, Hamdan wrote, quote, "A Muslim brother is martyred by the Canadian police after he killed a Canadian soldier in retaliation to Canada's crimes in Iraq. He said that Canada is terrified." However, in his report, Justice Bruce Butler noted that Quote, "These posts are difficult for the average Canadian to read or understand. This is because Mr. Hamdan expresses support for the actions of lone wolf terrorists, and the reasons he gives for saluting these actions defy logic. The suggestion that it is rational or acceptable to kill or for someone to kill unsuspecting non-combatants in a civil setting is repugnant. However, the posts do not contain statements that could be considered active inducements and encouragement for readers to go and commit similar offenses." So
It's all
what
a
we
matter of
see,
perspective, is the sense I'm getting.
it really is all a matter of perspective. I mean, some people could read those posts and say, "Oh, well, he's just, he's just making things up. He's just trying to, trying to get people talking." But other people, and certainly the RCMP investigators who went through it, saw it. This is a serious thing. We need to take this seriously because something could happen here.
Right.
And if something does happen and we don't do anything about it, that's going to look a lot worse.
So the lens that I would like to draw everyone to is, imagine you're living in the Second World War in Canada, and you see someone spreading German Nazi propaganda in World War II. What would happen to that person in World War II?
Especially if they're pointing out the security flaws of a bridge,
right?
Or if they're talking about a hydroelectric dam that provides lots of power. I think they would be very swiftly arrested, very quickly, right?
Exactly.
And quite clearly he was arrested here, and there's a reason why he wasn't let go. But what we really see here is a travesty of justice, where a man who clearly openly supports terrorism and terrorist attacks was acquitted. And really, I think our hope will be that the CBSA frowns upon this sort of behavior, either deports Hamdan back to Jordan or takes another look at this to send a clear message that Canada 100% does not tolerate terrorism. What's really interesting about this is that the media should have been covering this quite a bit, right? I mean, this is an ISIS supporter who, claims support for them and wanted and clearly wanted these things to happen. But this was only found in a few local BC papers, and the national media definitely was not talking about them at all. I couldn't find anything about him on CBC or the National Post or the Globe and Mail or any other of the national media outlets. And this is not something that is just to do with BC. This is something that concerns all Canadians,
right.
I think.
And, there's a similar story to this, tangentially related at best. For a Quebec man who tried to join ISIS, he was just sentenced yesterday to 9 years in prison for attempting to leave Canada and trying to join ISIS. But on the other hand, here you have this person who is clearly in support of ISIS in Canada and has been posting targets on social media, but is getting acquitted. That seems a little bit different right there. So
it does.
The story on Ismail Habib, who was the one who was sentenced to 9 years for trying to join ISIS. That story exists in CBC, CTV, the Montreal Gazette, the Toronto Star, the Montreal Gazette, a good number of places. Whereas, like you said, this one is specifically limited to BC. So that's a little bit interesting and disappointing from the media.
Indeed. And I think that brings us nicely to our next segment, which is Word of the Week. And the Word of the Week this week is acquit. And to acquit something is to relieve from a charge of fault or crime, or to declare not guilty. As in, the jury acquitted her, but I still think she's guilty. That was the example used by dictionary.com. I didn't come up with that on my own. So basically, what is interesting here is that being acquitted of a crime is only meant to be found not criminally guilty of a crime, and to be called criminally guilty of a crime, it means there needs to be beyond a reasonable doubt that someone had committed a crime. and there has to be a burden of proof on the party for them to be able to call someone guilty. So being acquitted of something just means that they weren't able to find them guilty. So that's why we call someone who is acquitted to be not guilty. It does not mean the same thing as innocent, which is to be found innocent is basically innocent of a crime, and they had no action partaking in that crime. Whereas being found not guilty just means that they couldn't find you guilty. And I think that's something that
It's a very important distinction to make.
Yeah, and I think that's something a lot of people might be a bit confused about here, is that just because he is acquitted of this crime does not mean that he's not actually guilty. And I think that's something important to note in a lot of criminal trials that go on in Canada and in the US that get publicized all over national media, is that even though the courts may find someone to be not guilty and acquit them of the crime, does not mean that they're not still guilty. And I think that's something that is a problem with the justice system for sure, but it also means that people aren't being falsely imprisoned or charged of crimes that they didn't commit, just because there's such a high burden of proof.
Indeed. All right. Well, that is certainly great work of the word of the week to end this episode on. So we'll have to see if anything else happens from this individual here, despite the acquittal. As you said, doesn't mean he's innocent. But if you guys want to find the full show notes for this week's episode, that's at rightsidenews.ca. We're also on Twitter and Facebook at rightsideca, where you can find all of our news stories that we post in the middle of the week, because you might see that we only have 4 stories here, but in reality we have a lot of stories that we work through and consider for this podcast, and the vast majority of them do end up being posted online. If you want to subscribe on iTunes, that's rightsidenews.ca/iTunes, and also on YouTube at rightsidenews.ca/YouTube. So I believe that's it for this episode of The Right Side. We'll see you next week, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
And yes, we'll be here next week, where we will share with you more of the right side of the news. And with that, we will see you next time.